Hello! So I just got done rewatching Psycho for the joy of the Spooktacular October Dark Movies special month. You may know Psycho as being the Alfred Hitchcock directed 1960 masterpiece starring Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh, and Vera Miles, the latter of which is the only surviving cast member alongside Hitchcock's own cameoing daughter Pat. Now, I probably don't need to say that much about this movie. Everyone knows Psycho. Most people, at least. It's a horror classic. It's a cultural icon. It's a beautiful, dark, mysterious, well written, well edited, well directed, well acted, well shot piece of cinema that is fondly remembered to this very day. Hitchcock was so enthusiastic about this film that he took money from the film's actual grossing instead of taking his usual paycheck. The producers, or the film distributors, or whatever, were very anti-confident in this movie. They thought it was going to flop. They thought people were going to hate it. The critics were mixed about it, but the audiences loved it. It was a huge success. The iconic 6-minute trailer that shows not a single shot from the actual film is especially brilliant, and the strict rules of no one leaving the theatre or being allowed in after showing up late are all just amazing things that add to the context of this film. So, a remote location, an evil mother and her obedient son, civilization so far away. Basically the perfect setting for a horror movie that is just looking to make you feel as tense as possible and as claustrophobic. For those of you who don't know what this film is about, Marion Crane, a woman who embezzles $40,000 from her boss's client and winds up at the Bates Motel run by Norman Bates, a man traumatized by the constant verbal abuse from his wicked old mother, an unseen character who is revealed to be the titular psycho responsible for the murders and other going-ons at this isolated location, is unfortunately murdered there. Now, I love how Norman Bates is essentially on a leash all the way through, which is backed up by his iconic line, "A boy's best friend is his mother." For those of you who don't know, Norman Bates has a rare supernatural form of split personality disorder that causes him to become possessed by the spirit of the mother he murdered. What's so fascinating about Norman is he isn't just another killer, but rather a charming, handsome young man who unintentionally uses his nice nature to trick people, effectively being the first of a long line of iconic movie serial killers whose personalities completely contradict their outer shells. You find yourself relating to and understanding him, but at the same time, you acknowledge how pathetic he is and what a weak-willed man he really is, taking orders from this elderly woman, this weak, frail creature who sits at the window, just watching over him and the girls he's aroused by. Of course, the score to this film is one of the most beautiful pieces of work to ever grace the silver screen, with a very effective shower murder scene still holding up to this day. I couldn't help but feel for Norman Bates because he's trying to run this hotel, but then his stupid mum keeps killing all the customers and making him more dependent on her. This is one of my favourite films of all time for all these reasons and more. Although it was considered too disturbing and shocking at the time, it was an immensely successful film that allowed filmmakers to invest their time and money into telling more disturbingly dark tales that they wanted to tell. It opened up a new world of cinema that everyone enjoys all the way to this day. The violence seems tame, and most of it is a bit off-screen, but that really does add to the tension and the fear factor. The imagination it gives you is more than anything a filmmaker can show you. It's not even that violent or sexual. It's all up to you to imagine how grisly it is, you fucking sicko. Also, for those of you who don't know, the shower scene actually has a double meaning. The main character was thinking of returning the money and admitting guilt to the situation she got herself into, and the shower represents her redefined purity. She is cleaning herself of her criminality, and that's why she is way too excited about getting clean. Just a shame that it was too late. You know, there are some things that you just can't or never get a chance to take back. Ooh, that's deep. Any film that kills the main character halfway through and introduces a new one will always be compared to Psycho, because that's just how amazing it is. The only real problem with the film is the Doctor essentially explaining us the twist of the film, but it's so well written and performed, it really doesn't come across as that distracting, and you just can't take a point off for it. Maybe Alfred Hitchcock could have depended on his audience to be a bit smarter than he was anticipating them to be, but it was his film at the end of the day, and that's what he chose to do. It really is a groundbreaking, magnificent film, and I cannot recommend it enough. 10 out of 10. God, it's just masterpieces, right? Like, you do not need to continue them at all. They're just, on their own, amazing works of art. They are incredible. They are just, I don't know, like, you just don't need any continuations. You don't need any sequels. You don't need any reimaginings. Like, all you need is for this thing to just exist and nothing else like it, or trying to be like it. What the hell? Hey, Hug. Oh no. Oh. Oh no, 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 no. Richie, go get the cyanide. Now that we're in my natural habitat, let's talk about some movies. And it's that time of the month. Not that time of the month, it's Halloween. It's Halloween. So I'm pretty sure not many people have heard of Psycho 2. And believe it or not, it exists. Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece had a sequel. Is it awful and insulting? Did Alfred Hitchcock roll over in his grave? Well, I can't really say I agree with either of those opinions. I will admit, it's kind of sneaky how they released this film literally 3 years after he died, and that was the only way they could make it. The guy never did sequels, but Hollywood will be Hollywood. You think they're doing it recently with that Doctor Sleep movie and the It movies? They've been doing this shit for 3 fucking decades, maybe longer. In fact, the actual book Psycho 2 was not only a sequel to the original book of the original film was based on, but it was an unrelated standalone sequel that served as a satire on the Hollywood world. But obviously Hollywood didn't like that, so they just made a Norman Bates character study, essentially. Norman is such a charming and likable character, you just can't help but fall in love with him just a little bit. Apparently, Anthony Perkins and Meg Tilly hated working with each other. He demanded she was fired, and she was almost recast by Jamie Lee Curtis at one point as a sick throwback to her mother being slashed to death in the original film, Janet Leigh, but they just stuck it out. Either way, this film is actually pretty great, and I'm going to tell you why. So the film is about Norman Bates, who, after being released from the institution, returns to working at his motel, making a new friend with an equally mysterious, slightly horrifying past herself. And to make things worse, his mother seemingly comes back to haunt him. Not Mrs. Bates, his real mother. So right off the bat, they got Anthony Perkins to come back. Now, you gotta have Norman Bates in the 23 Years Too Late Psycho sequel. And I think it was a great idea to make the film about him. Psycho was never really about Norman himself, so shifting the focus to him was a really good idea. He's an interesting character, and it's equally interesting to see how he fares after 22 years locked away in a mental institution. Oh yeah, it came out 23 years later, but for some reason it takes place in 1982 and not 83. I don't know, like, they just didn't care, I guess. Perkins is amazing in this film, honestly. Apparently he didn't want to do it, but then he read the script and remembered what an amazing actor he is, so he decided to take the role. Vera Miles also comes back as Lila, Marion Crane's sister, and Meg Tilly plays Lila's daughter Mary. Marion, you get it? You gotta keep this shit connected. They all do a fantastic job. Robert Loggia is pretty good for the time he's in it, but he doesn't have all that much to do. Yeah. Oh my god, it's Robert Loggia. The suspense intensity in this movie is amazing. The score to this movie is nowhere near as good or as weird and enjoyable as the first one, but it is very atmospheric and interesting in its own way and matches the tone of the film. It very nicely homages the original film by showing the infamous shower sequence in the opening before a very effective shot of the Bates home, with the score in the background and a big Psycho 2 title.
It's a lot more psychological than the first one. There are many twists and turns here and there, and I really appreciate them. I like watching how these setups play out later on in the film. The script by Tom Holland, no, not that one, is actually really well written. The characters make sense, are enjoyable, and the actors support them nicely. Mr. Toomey is like the perfect douchebag to just die when the time comes. My favourite scene in this film is definitely made by the actors. They actually use the word psycho many times in this movie. I don't think they ever used the word psycho in the original film. You even build some sympathy for Norman, and you come to understand him and how things were for him as a kid. The sound design in this movie is pretty great. I love the footsteps, the slasher sounds, the small details in the doors moving and such. It's just great, really. I like to think Scream took inspiration from this movie because I noticed a few similarities here and there. Nothing big, but Scream definitely took inspiration from Psycho 2. Meg Tilly seems genuinely disturbed whenever she's on set. Her character is always very cautious and does things like sleeping with a gun and locking the door with a chair whenever she stays at Norman's house. It ups the gore and the practical effects in a way that is really great. It does leave some to the imagination, and I appreciate that because that's what the original film did. The best thing about this movie is probably the twist at the end. So what the film does is it makes it clear Norman isn't crazy, or at least not completely. There is definitely someone harassing him, but everyone thinks he's slipping. Mary starts off not sure about things, but then it turns out her and her mother Lila, Marian's sister from the original, were conspiring against Norman. Mary starts feeling bad, stops doing it, but then Lila keeps going. Some murders happen. We don't know if it is in fact Norman going crazy or Lila taking things too seriously. I love how insane Lila is. Like, she'll literally sacrifice her own daughter just to get Norman locked up again. There's one slightly humorous moment when they're arguing in a hotel and some concierge tries to listen to them, but the Hoover, the janitor, obscures their conversation for him. I thought that was amazing. So some weird shit happens. Lila claims that she hasn't been calling, but then it's revealed that she actually might be. Norma's room is all fixed up, but it goes back to being abandoned, and it's later revealed Mary did this herself. A mysterious figure, possibly Norman, watches Mary in the shower, more phone calls, a strange note calling Mary a whore, love mother that disappears when Norman reads it and throws it on the ground. So Lila is murdered by a mysterious figure we assume to be either Norman or Mary when she sneaks into Norman's basement and puts her disguise on, because at this point it's made clear she has been dressing up like Norman's mother and doing weird shit. But now there's another murder, and then they find the dead body of a teenager that was murdered in Norman's basement, presumably either by Norman or Lila, even though Lila has been murdered by this yet-to-be-identified other murderer. And then Mary tries to get Norman to stop talking on the phone despite no one being there, and she accidentally kills Robert Loggia. Oh my god! Robert Loggia! Then she tries to kill Norman, and is killed by the police. The movie ends with Norman not having been crazy, but simply confused, and his name is cleared. JK! So the final twist of the film is that a sweet old lady named Mrs. Spool, working at the diner Norman was giving a job at, was his real birth mother, who gave him to her sister Norma. She reveals that she murdered Norman's disgusting hotel manager, the boy in the basement, Lila. Then Norman poisons her with the same tea he poisoned his aunt with and whacks her in the head with a shovel before casually whistling, picking her up and taking her to the bedroom before proceeding to talk to himself with her voice. It's pretty funny and pretty disturbing. The last shot of this film is amazing. It's just Norman's silhouette standing before his house with the single window showing his mother's corpse's silhouette. Now, as great as it may sound, there are some problems with this movie. It's not perfect. It makes no sense that they would just bring Norman back to his trigger point just because he wanted to. The Doctor even acknowledges this, but who cares, right? We needed a sequel. Norman is a former mental patient and he's going back to a place he became mentally ill in just because he wants to. No big deal. There are some minor technical problems, but it's only in 2 scenes from what I noticed at least. Oddly enough, they're both at the diner. In the first scene in the diner, Anthony Perkins leaned against what's supposed to be some kind of like solid part of the counter, like a prop in the film's universe, but it shakes about like a hollow prop would. When he finds the note, there's a very obvious cut instead of using the same take. Besides that, pretty great, albeit kind of unnecessary sequel, to be honest. I don't really know what I was worried about. I definitely recommend this to a fan of the original who has an open mind. I think people who haven't seen Psycho might be able to enjoy it. I go as far as to say this is one of the best sequels ever made, or at least one of my favourites. But Patricia Hitchcock herself said her dad would have loved this movie, so I'll take her word for it. I'm going to give Psycho 2 a solid 9 out of 10. So yeah, the good old-fashioned sequel effect. I guess it's not that bad. Now, Psycho 3 is an interesting movie. So, not only was it the first commercial failure of the series, but it was directed by Anthony Perkins. Yet, Norman Bates himself was in control of his own work. It's not a bad movie by any means, but it's nowhere near the quality of Psycho 2, and definitely not the original Psycho. I'm going to try and be a bit more organised with this section, so let's start with the story. So, straight up, the story starts with anti-religious symbolism in the form of a voice screaming that there is no God. A yet-to-be-named woman training to become a nun accidentally causes the death of her sister when she tries to kill herself. She goes on the run and stumbles across Bates Motel after almost being raped by some freak called Dwayne, or Duke, as his friends call him, when he picks her up off the road. And the meat of the story is her and Norman falling in love. This movie's script feels like it's kind of rehashing the original, but it changes just enough so it seems like a completely different thing. Maybe not a completely different thing, but a different thing. I grant you there are very different movies with different themes and presentations of their stories, but there are so many almost identical elements. Credit where credit is due, it feels more like a homage than a rip-off. The detective mystery aspect is brought back when a nosy journalist named Tracy starts a case on the missing Mrs. Spall, hoping to expose Norman, going to great lengths to show him as still being insane. Yeah, I wonder why she would think that. So justified, the town telling her to leave Norman alone. Admittedly, we've got an interesting premise to work with. There aren't any twists or turns, and this film isn't as tense or as suspenseful. I guess Anthony Perkins and Charles Edward Progue were more keen on being upfront than subtle. I can respect that, but it's not really that interesting. The ending sequence is quite cool. Norman seemingly breaks the hold his mother has over him and destroys the corpse he always talks to. The Mrs. Spall thing is retconned, and his real mother was in fact Norma Bates. Tracy pleads Norman back to reality. Norman keeps the hand of the corpse, confirming he is in fact completely insane, with or without his mother's influence. Dwayne becomes a psycho and drowns in the signature swamp of the franchise. Anomalisa. It feels very much like an average slasher. There isn't much personality, although I do appreciate the incorporation of Perkins and Progues' morbid sense of humour. Norman Bates falling in love for the first time was kind of fun to watch. I don't really care that much about Tracy the journalist, but I'll get into that and why it doesn't work in its favour. I like the progression of Maureen's storyline and how far she is willing to go. Maureen is the nun who tried to kill herself and ended up at Bates Motel. Speaking of Maureen, Dwayne, Tracy, and Norman, the Fantastic Fucking Four, let's talk about the characters and the actors that make the story. Now, the way these characters are developed is interesting. They all have their own clearly made personalities. They change as the story progresses. They become clearer in their motivations and their beliefs. Norman Bates is as charming and fun to watch as he's always been, and Anthony Perkins does a great job. Just like Psycho 2, he's the best part of the movie. But the film shows us Perkins can act and direct at the same time. Like, God bless him for doing this. I kind of wish he didn't die from AIDS, or at all. Like, what an unspoken gem he really was. I've already talked about why he's such a great character and why Anthony Perkins is so brilliant. The creepy mother-son dynamic isn't that strong, but it's successfully creepy and entertaining to watch. It just doesn't really match the level it did in the original or Psycho 2. Maureen Coyle. We continue with this unfortunate trend of girls that have the initials MC. Marion Crane, Mary Crane, even though it's technically Loomis, but it can still technically be Crane. Maureen Coyle. Damn it, Mrs. Bates. Shit. So Maureen is like a mentally ill woman who runs away from the Catholic life after she accidentally kills a nun who tries to prevent her from committing suicide. She arrives at the Bates Motel and begins to fall in love with Norman. In the shower scene homage, instead of being stabbed to death, the film twists it, and Norman's mother watches in shock as Maureen is found in the bathtub, bleeding from her slit-open wrists. I loved this scene when I first saw it. She hallucinates and thinks Norman is some angel, and God gave her a second chance to live. And she and Norman start to fall in love while she starts to reinstate her faith, both in God and begins to have a lot of faith in Norman. Maureen becomes more unstable as the story progresses, however, and she kind of disappears for a while before suddenly just coming back, ready to jump into Norman's arms, only to get game ended in a very similar way to the staircase death from the original. I did like that little recreation. Diana Scarwood does a great job. Her character isn't necessarily complex, but she definitely helps keep her interesting. She sells the role quite well, being the weak, blonde, vulnerable woman. It's a typical role, but it does work in this movie's favour. Dwayne the Duke. I kind of love and kind of hate this guy. Dwayne is basically an irreverent, rapey drifter who aspires for a life as a famous musician. He randomly helps a hitchhiking Maureen before throwing her onto the side of the road after he basically sexually assaults her and gets a job at the Bates Motel, coincidentally just as she arrives. What a quirky, awkward coincidence, am I right? So he just kind of fucks about. He betrays Norman and helps Tracy after she charms him and he fails to charm her. He has sex with some bar trash who gets murdered by Norman and doesn't bat an eye when Norman starts cleaning up a phone booth very suspiciously, knowing he can just report it to Tracy. He has the best line in the whole movie. He says something like, "I knew he was a geek, but a Looney Tune?" I chuckled for a solid 30 seconds. Later, Duke just goes completely insane and finds Mrs. Spall's corpse and bullies Norman with it. He gets his ass beat by the Looney Tune himself and drowns in the swamp just like everyone else did. Jeff Fahey, some of you might know him as Frank Lapidus on Lost, does a good job playing this character. He's probably the third best performance in the whole movie. Then we have Roberta Maxwell, a fellow Canadian. She plays the journalist Tracy. I hate her character, but that's why I think she works so well. Although Tracy is technically the hero who is attempting to expose a dangerous, mentally ill murderer, and Norman is the villain, Norman is so charming and likeable that we can't help but not like her and her perfectly fitting sly, rude, nosy attitude, which creates conflict in the film for the viewer, and I found her to be pretty effective. Tracy's storyline is actually quite interesting. She's a very skilled journalist. She starts off as an annoying and uninteresting character, but she gradually shows herself to be a very determined, well-trained journalist, putting the pieces together and finding out new things that we kind of already technically know. Mrs. Spall was obviously insane and couldn't have been Norman's real mother. I like to think Joker took some inspiration for Penny Fleck. Please, Todd Phillips, feel free to privately message me and confirm this. Or just make Hangover Part 4. Roberta Maxwell is fine. She's just fine. Nothing great. Perkins either didn't direct her well, or she just isn't that good, but she's not really anything special. Hugh Gillen is back as Sheriff Hunt from Psycho 2, and he's fun to watch, just almost as much as he was in the first one. There's this fucking hilarious scene where he gets some ice out of an icebox where a dead body is stuck in it, and he just doesn't notice as he shoves a block of bloody ice into his mouth, sucks some water out of it, and spits it back out. Some of the more minor roles and actors still do a great job with the scenes they're in, although sometimes they're just fine. There are a lot of scenes in this movie that I genuinely enjoyed. The scene where Norman is dumping all the bodies and leaves Dwayne to drown was visually interesting. I love the twist of Maureen killing herself in the bathtub. The staircase death was cool. The first actual murder scene was pretty effective. Norman talking to his mother was pretty great. The reincorporation of Norman stuffing birds and eating candy corn, which is something we didn't see in the second one, was a nice little detail. The direction, as I've already said, is pretty on point. The struggles Maureen has as she thinks more about the meaning of life and her beliefs is interesting to watch. And the Cabin 12 scene is just so weird, kind of hot, and so just fucking morbid and crazy that you can't help but just want to watch it 11 times over. The use of a kid-friendly cartoon in the background is such a great contrast to the actual tone of the scene. There are some scene transitions that were genuinely quite cool and interesting to see play out. There are some minor details that I want to mention that are pretty effective, either positive or negative, without mixing the two together. This film feels very 80s. The other two films feel fairly timeless. I mean, Psycho is obviously a 60s film, but it has an endlessly rewatchable feel to it. Psycho 2 has a similar effect. If you can't really take 80s stuff, maybe you won't find this as enjoyable, especially with the added morbid sense of humour and that the other two lacked. For me, it adds to the experience. This film has a lot of strange sexual themes, and like I said, is very comical, and that really adds to the uncomfortableness and the creepiness of it. The overall vibe to this film was quite disturbing, but not enough to actually make you feel it all the way through. One thing I do appreciate is the sex scene wasn't just gratuitous. It had a point to show more of Dwayne's character and set up the first proper kill, which, as I think I've already said, was pretty effective and fun to watch. Psycho 3 isn't the best in the original theatrically released trilogy of Psycho movies, but it feels special enough so I can appreciate what it is. Its biggest weakness isn't how much it distances itself from the other two in terms of tone and personality, but more how it just kind of stands there. Like, no one wanted a Psycho 3. If Anthony Perkins didn't direct the movie, it probably wouldn't be even remotely interesting. His vision is the thing that saved this from effectively being garbage. I don't even talk about the soundtrack, which is basically nothing compared to the other two. It's an okay film, it's a decent Psycho film, it just kind of exists. I'm going to give Psycho 3 a 6 out of 10. I've upped the lighting for this section of the video because this is kind of where the scare factor ends. Because while Psycho 1 through 3 could be considered somewhat scary in some ways, especially for Psycho 3, it's mainly a first viewing. You won't find it remotely terrifying if you watch it a second or other few times. But the other two are definitely quite freaky. This is where the horror factor ends. Every movie from this point onward are not particularly scary. Bates Motel was a made-for-television movie created as a backdoor pilot for a television series that never happened. That is literally all it was made to be. People saw how Psycho 3 flopped because no one was that interested, but it still made money regardless. Like, $14 million is an audience. It's smaller than Psycho 2, sure, but people were still somewhat invested. So the producers did the next best thing and made this try to branch out to television. So the producers did the next best thing and they made this to try and branch out to television. So right away we have an interesting premise. A friend of Norman Bates with similar psychological problems has been granted ownership of the Bates Motel after Norman himself dies and leaves behind what appears to be the curse of his mother. It's a shame it makes no sense and is executed in such a poor way. The film takes a similar comedic route that Psycho 3 took, but it's less dark and more corny humour that the simplest of minds wouldn't unironically laugh at or not cringe at. The script to this film is genuinely dumb and the story makes little to no sense. So some kid named Alex West murdered his stepfather when he was a little kid, and the best thing the asylum thought to do was have him be best friends with the split-personality Norman Bates. After Norman dies 20 or so years later, which is completely glossed over and not even looked into, he leaves the motel in his will to Alex, who befriends an ungodly, annoying female sidekick, sort of love interest, called Willie, played by Laurie Petty. I have nothing against the actress, but her character is definitely the worst part of this film. She's supposed to be a comedic relief, but she's just embarrassing and cringy to watch every time she's on scene. Jason Bateman has an early role as a character called Tony, but I was so bored and uninterested that I didn't even notice he was in the film. And it was in such poor quality because who cares to digitally restore and re-release it? I couldn't even tell what was going on. I could tell how cheap and shitty the whole thing looked. I kid you not, the Bates Motel set looked like it was from some fourth wall breaking, intentional, obvious set. Like in a film studio. I got really bad flashbacks about the Aladdin remake and how shitty and soundstagey that film looked and felt. So the film had a trend in setting up these really boring, uninteresting, painfully cliched characters, such as Henry, the mysterious old guy who Norman knew as a child, which instantly ruins the Norman Bates backstory because it adds a father figure that Norman could actually like and trust as a kid. He's supposed to be isolated and alone and go crazy. If he had this nice Henry guy on his side, then he would have been fine. There's the villain, who, spoiler alert, is some asshole at a bank who wants to destroy the Bates Motel, but he's set up in such a weak and underdeveloped way, you just don't give a fuck and you just want it to end. You see some weird psychological shit of Alex being haunted by the Bates family or something and Willie getting stabbed in the neck. That's what you want to see, right? Unfortunately, the only bit we get is that Alex talks to Norman's ashes that he is allowed to carry around as if this asylum bullshit already didn't make enough sense. It's successfully creepy, but I think it's supposed to be charming in the way it's presented. The score to this film is unbelievably manipulative. It's basically forcing you to feel things that you shouldn't be feeling in certain scenes, or just won't because you don't care. The scene in the bank was especially guilty of this. It tries to be touching and charming, but the score ruins it. And the overall scene just isn't written in a way where it could be interpreted like that. There is one scene between Alex and a character called Barbara who serves as a role in the worst part of this movie, but we'll get into that later. I find it to be slightly charming and the least badly acted scene in the whole film. There's a bunch of shit I noted down just talking about how bored I was and how badly I just wanted it to end. I wasted paper on this movie, and that actually makes me angry. I wrote this script for this review mostly off the top of my head. I didn't even need any help from the notes. Credit where credit is due, it is so bad I actually do remember it, kind of. There's this really annoying montage of people telling Alex they don't know where Bates Motel is because they just moved here with a racist joke shoved in. And then the Bates Motel later on in the film gets a redesign and it looks fucking awful. The attempts at scares are beyond dreadful and even laughable to a degree. There are tons of cringy scenes meant to be funny and serious scenes that are just hilarious or boring. They attempt to expand on Norman's father, Jake Bates, and coincidentally his body is just found during construction of the motel minutes later. They also find Norma Bates's body, but that doesn't make any sense. Like, how did it get there? Did the bank guy do it? Who honestly gives a shit? Who fucking cares? They add a bit about how Alex has to pay the bank $10,000 for the awful reconstruction, but who cares? Willie is annoying. Alex is a typical awkward asshole mistreated by society. Like, you actually you feel the pointlessness of this film. You feel it in your brain watching it. So on to the worst part of this film. Barbara has her own role in the story that takes up like 20 minutes. The story completely shifts from Alex and his problems to Barbara and her problems. This character we've just been introduced to is just staying at the motel. A bunch of teenagers show up, business is going well. One of them catches her in the act of killing herself in a scene that pays homage and slightly rips off Psycho 3, intentional or not. She basically forces Barbara to try and hook up with some guy like 20 years younger than her. Then Barbara apologizes for rejecting him and thanks him for making her feel alive. Turns out all these teen guests were actually paying with ghost dollars, and their objective was to stop Barbara from killing herself. It comes out of nowhere, it has no link to anything else, it's completely retarded. I was half hoping it would become a hilarious comedic splatter and they would all get murdered by Alex in drag, but that would take effort. That would require the filmmakers to actually do something and make something entertaining. Alex says it's great to be alive to Barbara without realizing she almost killed herself. Hardy ha ha fucking ha. Terrible depiction of suicide. Terrible joke. Terrible ghosts. This movie was really disappointing. Like, I already knew it was going to be bad, but I thought it would at least be, like, enjoyably bad. But it kind of just made me angry. It kind of upset me a little bit. But in its defense, I wasn't bored. I did find myself laughing a fair few times. There were really long sequences where I was fucking bored, and of course sequences where I was just kind of pissed off. But it does have some entertainment value. I actually came up with my own story for this film. This is how I think it should have been structured. Recap the original Psycho that this is a direct sequel to, like Psycho 2 respectfully did. The first third of the film is about a fully grown, not child Alex making friends with Norman Bates in the asylum. Norman dies and Alex escapes the asylum, going to the abandoned Bates Motel, or now owned by someone else, and through some intentionally comedic and ridiculous events gets a fake name, big case of cash, and opens it up. The psycho spree continues through Alex West. Alex makes a friend with Willie, a homeless college student, who isn't some dumb comedic relief that isn't funny or entertaining in the slightest. Alex and Willie get in a final battle, and either it ends with Alex dying and Willie becoming a psycho for the proposed television show, or Willie dies in a dark comedy death scene and Alex continues with the legacy. Maybe you might have actually gotten picked up if you went with something like that. It's nothing great, but it's better than this, and the complete tonal shift that it takes. It is listed as a comedy on IMDb, but this film is funny not for the reasons it intended. I will say that. Also, they do this really terrible thing where they make Alex seem like a bit of an asshole to Willie, but she's so annoying and so incredibly unbearable and such a bitch that you're on Alex's side. You want him to be angry at this dumb woman and just have her piss off and go away. You want a character like Mary to come in and take place. That would be something. It would be nothing great, but it'd be something. It's nothing great, and it's completely unnecessary considering a much better show already came out almost 30 years later. I would definitely check that out over this, the Bates Motel series. I watched a couple episodes. It was pretty good. Fuck you, Richard Rothstein. I understand what you were trying to do, but goddamn. I gotta give Bates Motel a 2 out of 10. Just unbearable. So after Bates Motel failed miserably, everyone realised what they were doing wrong, but then they realised that Anthony Perkins still cared and wanted to carry on after that abomination happened. So he and Charles Edward Progg made a pitch that the studio didn't like because of Psycho 3's critical and commercial failure, so they brought Mick Garris in to direct, and Psycho's original screenwriter, Joseph Stefano, which just makes this film all the more disappointing to me because Psycho is such a well-written and crafted film, and this film isn't dreadful, but the script is by far my least favourite part of it. Some of the dialogue is just plain bad, and some of the actions behind the characters I found irritating, particularly Norman's wife Connie. I do think the use of the original score as well as the new score was cool, and I like the title sequence, which is a nice homage to the original film. The basic premise of this direct-to-television film is Norman Bates calling up a radio station, telling them the story of his mother's murder, and gradually revealing his desire to kill again, hiding under the fake name Eric. So we have an interesting setup that introduces us to the radio station characters who are talking about matricide, and Norman is inspired to call up by this due to his own personal history. Anthony Perkins is amazing as always. My only problem is Norman kind of feels like a different character to the other films, which is less a criticism of Perkins' performance and more of another jab at the script. Something about him just feels more distant from the other portrayals of him. He's suitably unnerving to watch and listen to, which I appreciate at least. In order to really impress me with a younger Norman, you have to catch the charm of the original. Henry Thomas kind of does this, and his performance is mostly pretty good, but there are a couple of lines where he screws it up, especially when he screams the iconic, "Oh God, Mother!" line. There's a female blonde with minimal clothing who was set up just to die. It tries to make it clear that she already knows Norman and fancies weirdo outcasts, but we don't get a strong feeling of this, and she dies 5 minutes later before we even care for anything beyond her breasts, which do appear in full view, so we have sex appeal, at least. Thank God for that. Stefano claimed that he thought the other two movies were too mainstream and committed to the contemporary splasher genre too heavily. Slasher genre. And I can see that with Psycho 3, but this is way more akin to a typical slasher than Psycho 2 is. Thomas is genuinely entertaining throughout the flashback, and I love the use of his line, "not inordinately," and it's done in such a funny way, which I do think is intentional. It hints at Norman's bad relationship, but we'll get into that. Also, "not inordinately" was a line said by Marion in the original. Nice. Rehash or homage? You decide. There's a decent homage in the next scene where Norman is reminded of Marion's death when he washes a cut down the drain and we're introduced to his wife. A big problem with this film is it tends to tell and not show that often. That can be excused by Norman's narration, but he literally just says things in basic conversation over the phone to his wife, and we're just told stuff without proper development. I think this film would have automatically been 10 times better if we started off showcasing this relationship. Her role as a woman who has to stay at work late while her husband prepares his own birthday surprise does tie into their relationship later, but, well, we kind of just forget it by the time it comes back into play. There's also the psychiatrist character who is a guest on the radio show Norman is talking to, and he realizes it's Norman, but the radio host and her crew aren't fully convinced yet, and it's later treated like a big twist when Norman literally says it's him. The psych man just disappears and is never seen again. The host dismisses him by saying he got on a plane, even though he made his intentions clear to call the police and get Norman tracked down, but this never comes back into play. The radio station do eventually do the same thing, but towards the end, Norman just hangs up on them and they're gone for the last 20 minutes. I'm glad they used this to avoid just making a shitty prequel, but it doesn't really go anywhere beyond having an excuse for all these flashbacks and Norman getting modern-day paranoia from reciting them. Speaking of flashbacks, so we get a clear view of Norman's life and his relationship with his mother. After his father dies, she causes him to laugh at a funeral by tickling him on accident, and then has a go at him despite it being her fault, and a fan blows the fabric off of Mrs. Debates's morbidly disfigured face while he's in the casket, and it isn't even that messed up. Why would you even have a fan there and not put enough effort in to make the reveal hideous and reactable to? I like Norman's narration and the actual sequence up until that point. I think the insight on the highlights of their relationship is touching, albeit slightly awkward in its presentation. The kid doesn't have any lines, which I'm so happy about. When we go back to 15-year-old Norman, it starts to get a bit more interesting. Even though Norman seemingly hates his mentally ill mother, he is fond of her to the point they literally have, no boundaries, and he does eventually find it very disturbing. But like I said earlier about most things in this film, it's not developed. One scene, and he's just uncomfortable being in his underwear in bed with his mother, and she comedically beats him after finding a really tame porno mag in his room. It's kind of successfully disturbing how she has this kid acting like her small child, and her big strong man looking after the hotel. There are implications Norman is very sexually frustrated when he doesn't want to be, and this is brought to light when he and his mother get in a really awkward situation, where she basically leads him onto her and gets angry when he gets an erection he couldn't control, and then forces him into drag and into a closet until he admits he's a girl called Norma. It could be interpreted as dangerously so bad it's funny, but I found it to be kind of effective, especially the scene transition to present-day Norman lying on the ground saying the same lines as little Norma. There's also a shot I really liked where we see the corpse mother and we get a slight glance of the living mother, which is slightly clever. It's in the sense that it's like what we see versus what Norman sees in the moment. It's subtle, but it's really cool to me. This happened earlier with the dumb blonde scene. There's a scene where Norman is peeping in on his mother going mental, and it's just really awkward and weird to watch. Olivia Hussey, I think it's pronounced, is so incredibly over the top throughout this film, and her accent is so bizarre. She kind of sounds like a European immigrant who just learned English doing an impression of the original Norma Bates. Her accent does kind of improve as the film goes on, and I do like how Norman basically admits he remembers his mother's voice very differently, so they're bound to sound different. That's a decent explanation for the vastly different accents, but Norma doesn't sound like someone who raised Norman. Her character is unbelievably wicked and cruel, and it fits these scenes perfectly. I mean, if you're willing to ignore her over-the-top performance, then I guess you can appreciate the character connection. Seeing how Norman is affected by her harsh punishments is quite effective, but I think he's more haunted by her acting above all else. I like how Norman is one step ahead of these radio people. Even though they have a technical advantage and can just call the police and say, hey, you know that guy, Norman Bates, who most likely got moved to a location you have a record of? Yeah, he's losing it again. he manages to go unnoticed. I actually found myself on the side of the psychotherapist who's supposed to be a massive asshole. Um, there are a whole bunch of errors in this movie that just kind of irritate me. It's mainly to do with film continuity, like, of the timelines of the movies. I was under the impression that this was a direct sequel to Psycho with no mention of Psycho 2 or 3, but then 3 is very briefly referenced in one scene and serves as what leads into Norman's second release and marriage, the plot of this film. There's a continuity error with a drink in that uncomfortable cross-dressing scene. The motel was supposed to be built when Norma met her lover, but it was already built from the beginning of the backstories. The poison Norma uses to kill his mother and her boyfriend doesn't work in terms of general logic because it would take a while for it to take effect in real life, and it's so bitter that they should have tasted it as soon as the drinks touched their mouths. The mother and lover's bodies end up in the basement, but the bodies were reported to have been found in the bedroom in the original film. Norman says his father died from bees in this film, but Mrs. Spools says that she murdered him in Psycho 3. You could excuse that as Mrs. Spool being crazy, but then again, it's more plausible than what this film just says. It doesn't work as a retcon, this movie, and it should have, like, just done better to follow its own franchise logic. The film doesn't actually feel very cheap, considering it was made for television. I would estimate it probably cost a little less than Psycho 3, but it still looks fine in terms of cinematography, set design, etc. Another problem I have this time with the Norman character is it casually mentions his taxidermy. It shows us, like, him doing it to his mother, which explains how her corpse wasn't so deformed, mismundled, and gross. But we don't actually see anything beyond that. No lead up, no showing, just telling. There's also a really bad edited shot when Norman is being bullied to box with Norma's boyfriend after a setup for what a slimy asshole he is, which was something to be looked at and thought about, but he was kind of just a cliche stepdad who kind of tried but was too much of an asshole. I really hate Norman's wife, Connie Bates. Basically, it's revealed she's the woman Norman wants to kill because she was desperate to get pregnant and tricked him into impregnating her when he didn't want a baby because his mental illness has proven to be genetic, and he doesn't want another Bates in the world. She's kind of annoying and just not very smart and badly written. The climax of this film I have very mixed feelings about. So, after Norman finally gets rid of his inner demons after some dumb speech by Connie, he decides to burn the house down, and even though he should be coughing his lungs out, I can forgive it because Perkins is brilliant in this scene as he's attacked by hallucinations of his 4 childhood murder victims. Blonde girl, Norma, stepdad, and what was the other one again? Oh yeah, there's a scene where he, like, murders a girl and puts her in the swamp. She was like the first victim he ever drowned in the swamp. I was half hoping for a decrepit, skeletonized, naked Marion Crane to come out of nowhere and attack, but I guess that would have been too far. This is definitely the most tame out of the 4 original movies. The hallucinations are cool, and Norman's big escape from his mother's grasp was satisfying. For some reason, he and Connie are dramatically and emotionally walking away from the burned down house hours after it was put out of its fire by the fire department. I guess it was for dramatic effect, but the last shot of Norma's spirit being trapped in the basement and demanding Norman come back was cool, so I guess I can ignore how dumb that was. Except, of course, I can't, because it was really dumb regardless of how subtle it was of a mistake. Overall, I was never bored while watching this movie. Like, sure, it has its problems, and it's pretty bad in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of details, both major and minor, to appreciate. It's about as good as a direct-to-television sequel that doesn't completely suck ass can be. Check this one out if you want, but I can't say I recommend it. I'd say it's worth watching if you're a die-hard fan of the original Psycho like me, who was just curious over what is often considered to be the official final chapter in the Norman Bates story. You might hate it, you might not mind it, but it's worth a single watch at the very least. It doesn't have much rewatch value, but it's far better than one might think it is, which I'm guessing is pretty awful. And I'm giving this one a 4 out of 10. So in 1998, an unexpected remake of Psycho was released, directed by Gus Van Sant, starring Vince Vaughn and Anne Heche? Hiche. You know what? I'm going to say Hiche because it sounds funny. Now, this remake is shot for shot, meaning it uses the same script with very minor tweaks and additions here and there. And when I say it's shot for shot, I mean it. Every scene is just recreated with nothing done to make it any better. It's essentially just a colorized version of the original. There was actually an error that Gus literally made in this film that was made in the original. The claim on his behalf was that this was an experiment to prove that shot-for-shot remakes don't really work. Essentially, he was trying to prevent a mistake by making a mistake. If he made this remake, no one else would. At least that's what I took from what he said. It's just a pointless bad idea for a film from start to end. At least Bates Motel tried something new, as awful as it was. I can respect it for that. So, believe it or not, there are aspects of this film I do appreciate. In the original, Alfred Hitchcock wanted an extended opening shot that the production company couldn't afford, and they made it in his memory for this film. I'm not even going to talk about the story, because like I said, it's the same fucking thing. The film in colour kind of takes away from the creepiness of the original, and while it does mess with the tone, it does look kind of nice. The colour palette is decent, the colours of the costumes are nice. It's a decent looking film, admittedly. The practical effects, while nothing special or groundbreaking or anywhere near as creepy or convincing as the original films, do have some effort put into them that you can tell. The lighting isn't on point, but it does a good job in certain scenes. Some of the more modern updates, such as a 90s cassette player and headphones, and the increase of money are fine. They're not great or necessary, and they could have easily just set this film in the 60s, but they work with somewhat resetting the film's time zone. While I really like, while I don't really like Vince Vaughn's performance, there are moments that last for like 10 seconds where he isn't that embarrassing to watch. The set for the office parlor is actually quite nice and successfully creepy, with all the stuffed birds and Vaughn's acting. I actually quite like the recreation of his reaction to Marian's death. He actually starts heaving and gagging. There's kind of a funny scene in the beginning where Marian's boyfriend is completely naked and says he can't leave with her because he needs to put his socks on. It's just a subtle play with the original line, so they changed something at least. In the scene where Norman is revealed to be hiding his mother's corpse, I like how Lila actually fights back and kicks him in the face, which gives me kind of Psycho 2 vibes of her psychoticness in that movie. They recreated the sync to eye transition, it's kind of cool. The problem with most of these positives is the original already had most of these qualities, and they just copied them. I know people hate on the 2011 The Thing, because it's essentially a remake under the guise of a prequel, but at least, enough of it had an original spin to make it feel like a somewhat different movie that might not stand on its own without the connection, but the idea of it being an imitation works with the actual logic of the films. That's about everything positive I have to say about this movie. The score is sometimes original and sometimes just a weird experimental remix of the 60s score. It's decent, but it's so badly mixed in the film. The film is clearly trying to be experimental to some degree, but it just feels like a really bad audio mixing thing because it's done in such a bad way and used so inappropriately with the scenes it's used in. The film actually goes from being a shot-for-shot remake to a shot-for-shot remake with really dumb, pointless, surreal environments, like a birdcage in the basement, some random giant stone in Norman's bedroom, some sexual imagery. The iconic shower scene and staircase death of Arbogast are completely ruined by these dumb, dreamlike images shoved in between of, pigs and BDSM women and clouds and stuff. It just feels so unbelievably pointless, and I hate to say it, but pretentious. It's not creepy, it's not exactly trippy, it's just bad. Some of the acting I just find really annoying. Sam Loomis is more of a sly asshole, and the woman Marion works with at the bank manages to piss me off with the small amount of screen time she has. Marion herself feels like a completely different character, and I didn't believe she was who she was from Anne Heche. She just kind of did her own thing, and Gus himself later admitted he just let her do this, and he should have directed her better. That was a bad idea to just let her go on a tangent, and I was very happy to see her die, which isn't good because I was actually kind of upset when Marion died in the original. You actually cared about her character. She was about to go back and face the mistake she made, and even though she was going to do it in this imitation film, you don't feel as strongly about her, so you don't care. Like, she's just Norman Bates' meat. Speaking of meat, in the classic Peeping Tom scene, Norman just starts whacking it for some reason. Like, Norman wouldn't do that. If you're gonna parrot a classic, at least stay true to the character. Norman is so creepy and lacks any charm in this film, and you just don't care about him. If anything, you want him to suffer from his stupid ghost mum's hand. I'm starting to think some of these positives I mentioned shouldn't even count, but I really want to give this experiment a chance. Like, the recreation scene of the rich cowboy flirting with Marion was a fun scene to watch in this format, but it just took something that was already great and represented it differently. You might say Force Awakens was just a remake, but at least it added some original stuff to make the film fun to watch. And like I said, the sound mixing is awful in this film. The score is used inappropriately, it attempts to be experimental by adding voiceovers in really inappropriate places. When I said Marion felt like a different character, I didn't just mean in terms of acting. The overall vibe I get from Anne Heche is very different to the original, and almost betrays Janet Leigh's portrayal in a way. Vince Vaughn is degrading. I really gave him a chance, but he lacks the charm, the sweetness, and the underlying softness of Anthony Perkins. He's just not suited for this character. His performance is so mismatched, and the stuff they add is just annoyingly bad. The recreation of the parlour scene in particular is painful to watch if you ignore that dumb masturbation addition to the Peeping Tom shot. I also hate the design of the Bates Motel. It's really modern and dumb looking and lacks the eerie highway feel of the original. Like, I'm not scared of it. The Bates home looks alright, sure, but the motel is the main attraction. The house literally isn't relevant until much later in the film, so who cares about how successfully creepy its design is, especially when comparing to the original, which is way creepier. There's a positive for you. Guess I wasn't done. Shame it's ruined by the interior being revealed to be all artsy and desperate to be different despite being so similar throughout the film and messing up the flow of everything. It's during these house scenes that the sound design and audio mixing becomes particularly annoying. Julianne Moore also manages to be pretty bad in this movie. I love Julianne Moore. She's a beautiful woman. She's a great actress, but she tries to make Lila Crane more aggressive and unlikable. But it just makes it harder for me to stay invested in the story and the quest to find the already unlikable Marion that we were glad to see die. The closing montage reaction is fine. It's just a cheap imitation that could easily be forgotten about, and you can just go watch the original. Apparently, Quentin Tarantino finds this movie better than the original. After doing some investigating and finding out what hurt him in his life, I'm going to make him apologise. I think the world receiving that apology is more important than him apologising for those stupid comments he made about the Roman Polanski statutory drug rape case. The movie sucks, and you should just avoid it completely and watch the original. I do appreciate the effort that went into replicating literally everything, but I can't say I'm sad it failed critically and financially. It had a budget of $60 million, and it feels cheaper than that. It feels very cheap, almost as cheap as the original. It feels really lame. It's much better than Bates Motel, but it's nowhere even near the level of quality of the original, or even Psycho 4. And I'm giving this one a 3 out of 10. The history of the Psycho movies is an interesting one, and in their own way, they're all interesting movies. They all have things about them that separate them from each other and make them feel like their own movies, with connections to a singular narrative about Norman Bates, with two very obvious exceptions. I'm aware there's a ton of other awful, low-budget, very obscure Bates Motel things, but who really gives a shit? As far as I'm concerned, this franchise was put to rest at an appropriate time. As bad as the remake is, I'm kind of glad that it exists because it follows the tradition of tons of sequels that are objectively inferior and a shitty remake. It just helps you appreciate the original so much more, and it helps people appreciate the second one, because those two are genuinely great films. If you want to know more, watch the Psycho Legacy documentary. Keep in mind, it is about Psycho. We learn very little about actually Alfred Hitchcock himself. They don't discuss the Bates Motel pilot or the remake, but they do give some insight on the films, and Janet Leigh had a role in it, which is nice considering she played one of the most iconic characters that only actually played a major role in the first film. If I had to rank the films based on how much I actually enjoyed them, it'd probably go 1, 2, 3, 4, Bates Motel, and remake. I find the remake least entertaining because even though it is definitely a better film than Bates Motel, I just found Bates Motel to be more entertaining in how awful it was, basically for the completely wrong reasons. So if anything, the remake should be honoured in how it is the least enjoyable one for me. Kind of. As actual films, the remake definitely overtakes Bates Motel. Yeah, I do still think that this definitely should have been laid to rest, because the ending to Psycho 2 was so perfectly comedically dark, twisted, and kind of freaky that it'd just be a great place to just end it. Psycho 1 and 2, two amazing films that exist far away from each other but exist nonetheless. I'm just happy that Anthony Perkins got to have fun with this 4 times. That's really all I can say. Thank you so much for watching, and happy Halloween.